Hey everybody, welcome back to the Vanguard Wall podcast. We're kind of excited. This is an episode that we've been working for a while. This is going to be part of a multi-series podcast where we celebrate the life of Master Sergeant Gregory Trent. Master Sergeant Trent was a Special Forces leader and a soldier who tragically was shot on the battlefield in 2012 in Afghanistan and ultimately succumbed to his wounds approximately 7 days later at Walter Reed. So first part of this story is going to be Dave Coulombe. Dave was the team captain for ODA 3424. That was the Special Forces team that Master Sergeant Gregory Trent was assigned to during that deployment. And so we thought it would be great to start with you, Dave, especially as the commander for that team, to give a little bit of the overall picture of what you saw on the battlefield, how that deployment, and ultimately, to talk about Master Sergeant Gregory Trent.
Imagine starting at the line, heart pounding, ready to earn your place among the elite. At Titan Coaching, former Rangers, Green Berets, SOF, airmen, and law enforcement specialists stand beside you, guiding every step of your journey. From land navigation drills and brutal ruck marches to pool prep for dive school and long-distance runs, they craft a plan tailored to your goal. SFAS, Ranger School, BUDS, Delta Selection, MARSOC, or law enforcement careers, you'll master body mechanics, dial in nutrition, and build mental resilience before and after the grind. If you're serious about earning the right to wear the badge or a tab, visit TitanCoaching.com for an exclusive consult. Titan Coaching, your advantage starts here.
But before we kind of really dive deep into the story, can you just give the listeners just a little bit about your bio, who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks, Asher. Appreciate it. So I'm from Chicago originally, south suburbs side, and I grew up in a very blue-collar family. My dad worked for Goodyear Tires most of my life, right? And my mom worked downtown, so really strong work ethic, and my family really taught me about working hard and perseverance kind of to the end. I also grew up in a pretty patriotic household because of my grandparents. So really from when I was young, I always wanted to be in the military in some way, shape, or form. I always wanted to serve my country. It's like what I always wanted to do. And basically my life was kind of set in that sense. So got the opportunity through a lot of work and things my mom and dad sacrificed for me. Got to go to West Point and commissioned from the academy into the Army. I was an infantry officer. Did a rotation to Iraq. I was stationed in Fort Richardson up in Alaska in the Airborne Brigade up there. After I did my time in Iraq, I saw a lot of SF guys while I was over there. And I was like, that's what I want to do. Next time I come back here, I'm going to come back with an organization that I thought was a lot more effective and able to get things done. I always wanted to push the envelope and challenge myself. So went SF and I ended up at third group. Did first rotation to Afghanistan, and then my second rotations actually were right before that, about a year, picked up 3424 as their team leader, and that's really where I met Greg early on at that point in time. Since then, I've carried on my career, soon to retire in the next 40 days, technically.
Well, sounds cliche, but I just want to say thank you for your service. I know you've done a lot. I know when we were prepping and planning, I got to learn a lot about you, and you like everybody else in this story, are just kind of the epitome of the quiet professional. And I know you're not going to see on camera all the different things you've been a part of, but I know, and on behalf of me and my team, we just wanted to thank you. I have a series of questions we'll go through, and it's kind of something that you and I talked about. It's really just kind of to really help tell this story the best way that we can. So I'm just going to kind of start, at the top. And for you, Dave, as the team captain for ODA 3424 in 2012, you led a tight-knit group of Green Berets, including Master Sergeant Gregory Trent, through one of the most intense deployments in Afghanistan. Can you start by painting a picture of what it meant to lead this team? What was the mission, the stakes, and the bond that held you guys all together?
Yeah, for an officer, there's a lot of things that are talked up to you. From when you're a cadet to when you're a very young lieutenant, going through training. And obviously, Special Forces is something that's put on a high level pedestal. as an infantryman, right, you looked up at the soft units. I was a light infantryman, right? So it was kind of the natural, like, oh yeah, if you keep going, right, and if you're good enough, you can go, to that echelon. You can keep working forward to that. So in that sense, it was kind of this idea of accomplishment, right, to go and move on to this thing. It's also really, like I said, from my youth, I wanted to be in the military. And I remember specifically playing Green Beret as a little kid, right? So it's something you always really wanted to do. So in that sense, it's kind of this idea of achieving something, right? You finally got there. But selection's continuous, like we always say, right? So now you make it, you go through the course, you do all this training, you arrive at your detachment, and there's nothing greater for an SF officer than to command an ODA. But at the same time, you have to perform, right? It is a tight-knit group into itself. It's an NCO-dominated organization because of its tight-knitness. If you're an officer who is there, you need to be one who comes in and establishes that you are technically proficient, tactically proficient, and you have a good, solid heart that's going to lead them where they need to go. And you need to really not be a careerist type officer to be an effective SF detachment commander. It's really about selfless service, and you have to weigh into that. It's also a lot different than the regular Army because you don't have your rank to lean on to as much. Now, I always thought it wasn't the day you had to lean into your rank was the day you kind of failed to really establish effective leadership anyway. But it's definitely a lot more natural in the infantry in that kind of pyramidal structure versus SF, where these are all senior NCOs. Yes, I have a deployment under my belt, and I had been in combat, but they had been on multiple tours to other, lots of different theaters, and they had been in SF a long time. So it's very intimidating when you show up. It's kind of an intimidating thing to show up there. But I knew immediately kind of I had a special team, just based off of how I saw them interact with each other. When I first got to the team, it didn't have a lot of the same guys that it did by the end of the rotation. We had a couple guys who were about to swap out, but there was a core group of dudes who had been there from the previous trip, and one of them was Greg. And you could tell that it was a tight-knit team. You could tell that they knew what each other was thinking. When we went to the range, I remember the first time I went to the range, their professionalism on executing tasks, their knowledge of what to do, was very much like exactly what you think you would expect from a Special Forces team. But at the same time, their humor and their tightness was something that was impressive to me. I didn't know this until really the rest of my career, having seen a lot of other ODAs, in my time, as an SF guy for the rest of my career. We had a really special team. And I don't think the weight of it really hit me until far later on how unique our team was from its cohesion. And you've helped me kind of see that too. So that's what I fell in on, and we had a long kind of good chance to train up prior to our deployment. The deployment itself was going to be a village stability operation mission, which at the time was, I guess you could say, an attempt to kind of flip the script on losing terrain in Afghanistan, a different approach. But it's kind of back to the future in the sense too. This idea was used in Vietnam by SF, right?
For those people out here that are listening that may not understand what village stability operations are, could you explain that just a little bit?
Yeah, as the idea of village stability operations is, I guess you could call it ink blot, right? Security through an ink blot. Instead of being on these faraway bases where we just kind of fly in and go after the enemy and really create havoc with the local population, we're going to embed in a local area and really live with them. We're going to live with the local population. And from the local population, we're going to build local police forces. It's basically community watch forces, if you could think about it for an equivalent. Because nobody cares more about your area than the people who actually live there. So we build a local security force, train it up completely, right? Make it into a coherent defensive posture, checkpoints all around the area, and then we tie it simultaneously. It's like the security line, but there was also a development and a governance effort as well. And the development was about providing services to the extent that we can, getting them, their local tribal elders, to stand up and actually take responsibility for their own areas. And then the harder thing to do in the long run was really tie it back to the Afghan government. But that was what we were attempting to do. So that was our mission. We knew we were going to fall in on that. It was a lot different than previous rotations. A lot of guys had, I guess called more kind of classic direct action type missions. This was going to be a lot more intrigue, if you will, because we were going to have to live with the local population. So we knew that. We were training up for that specifically. And I think the other aspect too of our mission prior to that deployment was they changed our AO like 3 times prior to.
And like one of it was like, I think, what, a couple weeks before you guys ripped in the country?
It was shortly before, literally, you're right, a couple weeks before. And it was radically different too, right? We had planned primarily to go to eastern Afghanistan. It was either Paktika or, Paktika, I think. And we were going to be with our battalion. Like the battalion was going to deploy coherently. It was going to be the Special Operations Task Force with that. We were going to be part of it. That last minute change of mission, we got attached to SOTF West, which was on the other side of the country, right? The far western side of Afghanistan on the border of Iran. And we would be under Marine Special Operations Command, SOTF. So that was a totally different AOR, totally different chain of command. And a lot of, quite frankly, the knowledge that a lot of people had on the detachment, because SF usually spent a lot of its time, especially 3rd Group on the eastern side, it kind of wasn't there readily. However, Greg had been to that part of Afghanistan before, and that was also Greg's responsibility to really learn all that. And it's the little things that you look back and you're like, wow, that was a lot of work. Greg is the 18 Fox, the intel sergeant. He's responsible for the mission analysis and really the intelligence preparation that we all know what we're doing before we go in there, right?
You and I had a conversation too when Greg found out that your guys' mission had changed from that part to this new area we were going. I remember you told me he walked outside and smoked like almost a pack of cigarettes.
He did. Yeah, he did. One of the things I can remember most about Greg is him smoking, which I don't know if that's a good, but it is, and Greg definitely smoked more the more he got stressed, right? He was a dude who never really, he was smooth, cool, right? Cool hand Luke. The only real tell that Greg was stressed was that he started smoking a little bit more, right? So when we found out that that's where we were going, out in Shindan, he went outside and just burned through a pack. And I don't know if I had gone out there or come back. I think it was really more telling, because I think when we first heard that, it was like, oh, that's a bad area. Like he just literally leaned back. I was like, that's a bad area. And then he went outside. I think I probably went out there. I'm like, oh yeah, obviously I want to know, right? And you could just tell he had there was a lot processing in his mind from previous trips there. He rarely, even when we were deployed, rarely talked about his trip where they went into the valley, other than just to talk about here we had contact. He could tell us the historical, this is where we took contact, this is where this was, right? We'd find IEDs here, but he rarely ever talked about that trip.
What was your vision for the team kind of at the very beginning, and how did Greg kind of fit into that vision?
You mean for the deployment, or
yeah.
Okay? Yeah. So you
Well, I mean, kind of the deployment, but also the team. I mean,
Yeah.
you're a new ODA captain taking over.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of go back to that. The team sergeant and I talked about, hey, what do we want to do, right? And he had been new to the not new to the company, but he had just recently taken over as a team sergeant pretty recently too. And our goal was to make a solid SR team, right? That's what it was by trade, military free fall team. Our goal was to make this detachment what it says it does on its mission guidance letter. Make a premier special reconnaissance team. So we actually did a lot of special reconnaissance training. I love that. I love recce by trade, and it ended up being what I spend most of my time after, my team leader time doing that on the more unique tracks of how that gets done. But I love that. I loved sitting around the woods, sitting under, and camoed up, like under binos, looking through the glass. So we did a lot of that training. But our goal was to create really a team that was one of the preferred teams, because it's always a competition. It's always a competition within the battalion, within the company to be the best. That's actually one of the ways you get the missions in the old school way, is people will compete for missions, right? And our goal was to be viewed as one of the go-to teams. And my team sergeant had an amazing training plan. We trained a lot. We were gone constantly. Part of the issue really though out of that time was that we had so many guys who were younger and moving up. I had mentioned earlier from the previous deployment, a lot of those guys have rotated off the team. So we had to build a lot of internal capabilities inside the team, right? Like Greg was not an 18 Fox when I first showed up to the team. He was the senior Echo. So he had to go to the Fox course, and that's a long school. Greg did a lot of schools during that year train up, besides doing all of the workup, like TDYs that we would go to the range and all that. There was a lot of time away from home that the whole team endured. But it was a very intense training schedule, and I would say I love that because that's what I always wanted to do. I love to train. It's probably the thing I love the most about the Army is training. But that was what our goal was. And when we got on that rotation, also a unique thing about that is we were going to occupy 2 different location sites. So we were a split team, but we were split team to the point where we were almost co-located, right? So we split the team because we had 2 different sites in the same valley, and they were on the other side of the river from each other, really only separated by about 3 clicks, kilometers, 3 to 5 kilometers total, really close. But our AORs were bifurcated by the river. This half the team will take this side, this half of the team will take that side. And if you're wondering why, what's the historical reason for that, there used to be multiple detachments that were assigned to the valley because it was such a bad location historically that it was manned by multiple ODAs that thought it needed that amount of focus. Actually, at one point, there were 3 ODAs assigned to that valley. But over time, it did calm down, right? The program, we weren't the ones who stood up the ALP in that valley. First group is very they were very famous by the valley in there, right? They helped really set up the initial ALP and village stability platform that was there. And over time, it got better, and the determination was to downgrade it into a single detachment mandate, but there were still 2 different sites. So we were going to fall in on 2 different sites. And the goal was, for me, vision, consolidate, right? Function more as a team. I didn't see the role, or I didn't want to have the team really be that kind of split, right? My view was to run the whole valley as a uniform detachment, even though my Warren on that side has his own sector, and he is on his own. But the idea was to have a more expansive view of the valley. And simultaneous to that, one of my really good friends was he was the ODA that was advising the Kandak. So working with him about what kind of support we could do, mutually. And they were up at Shindan. And then another really good friend of mine, he was the ODA commander in Kakisafed, right in Farah, right beneath us, the district beneath us. Awesome dude. And we had designs because he's doing the same mission, we a 7th group guy, we had designs of linking our 2 AOs together and really creating this security, blanket, if you will, across what was traditionally a pretty high Taliban rat line trafficking area for weapons and munitions to move. So our goal was to really, bridge it across different detachments.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize too that area in the Zirkot Valley where you guys were was pretty close to the Iranian border as well. So
it's very close. I don't think I can recall mileage, but it's close. It is close.
Yeah, and just to kind of set the tone for the listener. So a full operational detachment alpha is 12 people, and you didn't have 12 people.
No.
And so not only that, you guys went into a hot area. You went into an area that originally or previously had up to 3 ODAs, and now you're kind of an understaffed ODA running split ops in a pretty dangerous area. So I think that's important as we talk about the story too. that you guys were essentially doing more with less and still, effectively accomplishing the mission for the most part.
Well, that's what SF really is sold as, right? You do more with less.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Hey everyone, we are excited to announce our new partnership with an awesome sponsor. When it's time to fuel my training, Alpha Country Training and Nutrition is my go-to. Founded by former Green Beret Spencer Lewis, Alpha Country crafts elite supplements to power warriors and athletes through the toughest challenges. They've got clean, effective supplements for endurance, strength, and recovery, plus apparel that actually performs. Whether you're grinding out early mornings or long miles, Alpha Country helps fuel that mission. One of their flagship products, Stay Ready Endurance, is a game changer, packed with cluster dextrin and mod carb, a premium, fast-acting, and slow-releasing carbohydrate source that keeps you fueled throughout your duration of your training. It's packed with blueberry and goji berry powders for natural antitoxin protection, has a full multivitamin blend inside, and also has electrolyte support through Himalayan pink salt and potassium. Clean, easy to digest, no bloating or heavy sugar crash that keeps you hydrated and energized during grueling workouts. Whether you're rucking in the heat, crushing high-intensity workouts, or training for Special Forces selection, this intro workout formula prevents fatigue and keeps you in the fight. Every ingredient is hand-selected for maximum performance because Spencer learned in the field, generic supplements just don't cut it. Alpha Country's entire line is built on transparency and quality, helping you recover faster and train harder. Ready to lead by example? Go to thealphacountry.com and use Vanguard20 for 20% off your first order. That's thealphacountry.com, code Vanguard20 for 20% off your first order. Power up and stay fueled with Alpha Country. Your body, your community, and your country deserve it.
Before we super dive deep into the nuts and bolts, I just want to say, this podcast is about honoring Master Sergeant Gregory Trent's life and legacy. From your perspective as his team captain, what's the one thing you want listeners to understand about who Greg was and why his story matters?
I think Greg is a dude who does things, or did things. I still think of him very much, here when I say things. Greg's a guy who did things selflessly. It was never about Greg, ever. It was always about somebody else, about the team, and most importantly, it was about his family, right? Like Greg did all that for his wife and his daughter, his mom and dad, his brother, and the greater nation too. Greg was somebody who never was about himself, ever. And I think that's one of my earliest really pickups of Greg, of thought, this guy is just a solid dude. So if I had to say anything about what to remember about Greg, it's that Greg was never for himself. It was never about glory, right? It was never about accolades. It was just about the silent appreciation of knowing you did something that mattered.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thanks for describing that. So we're going to kind of start early and work our way into the story. So take us back to when you first met Greg Trent. What was your initial impression of him as a soldier and as a man? And how did that evolve as you led ODA 3424?
Yeah, so like I said, you show up, you're the new guy. You're already an officer, so you're doubly the new guy, right? But it's something that's different than the other new guys, right, who kind of have to be flies on the wall to listen. You can't just listen, right? You have to demonstrate pretty quickly. Yeah, you're listening, but you also know what you're doing. Otherwise, they don't need a mascot. They need a commander. They need a leader. So you go in there, and I think I was struck most by Greg's warm-natured welcome, right? Third group is known traditionally, as I found out later on, as a multiple-term third grouper. And I became the group that I was pretty prickly to outsiders. Often later on, I had to caveat hey, I'm sorry if I come off hostile. I'm actually from third group, right? So I remember showing up and the stares of another new officer, and their previous captain was beloved by then, and I know we had talked about Ben, absolutely beloved. So Ben had big shoes for me to fill. But I walked in, lots of okay, well, we'll see how this guy fares. But Greg was there, as hey, well, great to see you. Where you coming from? Like very, very just warm. And I think that's the other thing that I would always remember about Greg: warm, genuine, just a nice guy, right? And I think that's the other thing too, that you meet a lot of people in the service, especially in SOF. It's a big world. There's a bunch of different types of cats under the tent. But there are people who are actually really warm and endearing people. It's not the machines that like were portrayed to be. And Greg was one of them, right? Like he was a dude who was able to execute his job to like laser focused precision, but he put it away and was just a warm guy. So like that was my first thing about Greg. That Greg was a guy who was super inviting to me. Greg also, I could tell, was funny. Like he was the jokester. In a very dry sense, but he could also be like super goofy, right? And I think, so that's probably the second really thing that struck me about Greg early on, besides, his welcoming, was how funny he was. And Greg was also a dude who always was silently doing the right thing. And I'll use this as an example. I remember early on we were going on like a trip up north to Pickett. I don't know what to call these bases now, but AP Hill, one of those, Pickett. We were going on a team training. And one of the things you always got to do is load out the pallets and whatnot, because you're going to line haul a bunch of stuff. And Greg was always out there kind of early working on stuff on his own, just silently toiling away at things, right? He's seemingly always just kind of working. But it was never had to ask Greg to do anything. Never had to ask Greg to do anything. Actually, and Greg wouldn't ask you if he was working on something. He was just always just working. And I think that was another thing that always, made me think of something of Greg. And I'll hold a different thought, because that translates later on the deployment. But this kind of silent, quiet professionalism that was always there. Those are the things I remember about Greg early on.
Was there a specific quality or interaction that defined him from day one?
I think beyond the things I just mentioned, I was impressed by Greg's his kind of expansive mind, right? He really was a great fox, A-Team fox, that is. And it was unfortunate that he didn't get to capitalize on that skill for longer, because I think he would have been probably one of the best A-Team foxes. He could put things together, an analysis that I think would have run circles around, tons of analysts, tons of other officers. He was very mentally sharp, just a very smart guy. And those kind of applications of him, right, were there. And honestly, Greg was somebody I would trust, right? Like if I wanted to know really what was going on, it was really, one of the things you really got to learn as an officer is to identify who's worth trusting, right? Whose advice is worth keeping, because all those guys have been there a long time, and they're gonna tell you something, they're gonna try and move you a particular way. But Greg was somebody I recognized early on that you could trust, and I leaned on him a lot for that.
Yeah, one of the things I kept telling you, as this kind of story progressed and we talked and I talked to other guys and I'd kind of circle back around with you, is like you commanded, I call them the Avengers, man. You have this group of guys that come from all these different walks of life, that has all these different unique skills, but kind of when you guys formed your Marvel comic group, you guys had like all these different superpowers. So it's going to be fun for me as we tell this story in multiple episodes to just show these different personalities, because it really was, eclectic's not the word, but it was just such a unique group, and Greg was definitely, a part of that anchor
right.
to that group, and I think that's kind of why I fell in love with this story, pretty early on.
Well, it's a reflection of the nation, quite frankly, right? I was thinking about it. There's only two guys were from the same state, right? And I mean, you got dudes from New York, dudes from California, Massachusetts, everywhere. And it reflects some are from urban areas, some are rural areas, and it reflects kind of that totality of different walks of life that America has.
Yeah. Describe Greg Trent as both a teammate and a leader. What did he bring to ODA 3424 that was irreplaceable in your mind?
I think as a teammate, humor. Like even in like the most dire situations, he was calming. He was calming because of his humor. I don't know what was going on inside of his mind, right? I'm sure it was, under the water, the ducks are spinning, like their feet. But, he was very calming. He was a calming presence. And I can't say that enough. He was also a guy, as a teammate, who was always there, like I said, silently toiling. An example, I remember this. We did this long patrol. We were trying to expand, early on before a lot of the fighting season kicked up. We were trying to expand our areas in south, like I said, to Farah. And so we went on this really long patrol out in the mountains. It was freezing. It was the winter. It was miserable, right? I had him sitting up top of the mountains. And I'll never, it's funny, I'll never forget. They're like, they built a fire up there, and they're like, you can't come by the fire because this is your idea. So that's funny, but I'm walking the line, on the perimeter, and I see Greg, just laser focused, standing out there watching his sector. I'm like, oh, hey, you want to rotate back to the, warm off the fire there? And he's like, no, I'm good. But he would have never said anything about that, right? He was just silently always doing like that little discipline that makes you a good soldier. Like that was Greg. Now, as a leader, I think the biggest thing that Greg provided was empathy. He was an empathetic leader, and he knew what it really meant to lead guys, how to really motivate them, and that one was valuable in a team. But remember, we had a lot of other assigned attached personnel on that rotation as well. We had an entire infantry platoon attached with us, a couple other civil affairs, PSYOPs teams, whatever. And Greg was a very empathetic leader. He knew how to lead not just senior guys who've been in special operations for a long time. He knew how to lead that E1, E2. This is his first rotation. And he had that kind of full mentorship that was very big Army-like, but at the same time could easily move into special forces, right, and lead our type of guys. So the other thing I remember about Greg, just as a leader, is that genuine servant leadership that he had. And again, I think that all stems from the fact that he had a very giving heart. It was all about others before himself.
That's awesome. Coming from your Chicago roots, and you and I talk, you have like this chameleon-like personality, growing up in Chicago. So coming from that, your adaptability, you talked about how Greg's background and personality meshed with yours. What was it about him that made you trust him implicitly, kind of as your teammate?
Yeah, I'm not gonna say Chicago and New England are alike, right? Because they're not necessarily. But one of the things, we talked about this, right? Like where I'm from, you got to know where to go. That's the right area to go, or it's not. You're going to have a rough day, right? And you got to know when to say something and when to keep your mouth shut, right? Because you got to know where you are at all times. But the other thing I love about where I'm from is there's kind of there's a no BS kind of attitude, right? This is what it is. Like we're not here to talk you up, make you feel better. What I loved about Greg, he had almost that mass, style like approach too, right? Of like, hey, this is raw, what it is. I'm going to tell you what I really think, right? You're not going to get filtered. But unlike a lot of, the stereotype of like, the people from Massachusetts, it wasn't over the top and like really like in your face, right? It was very genuine and warm. So I think, to your point about that, like, what about us meshed? I valued his actual realism. It was never BS. Greg was never trying to like fluff something up. He was never really trying to like puff himself up, right? It was never anything other than like, hey, this is what I think, very, deliberately, and I'm telling you like the truth that as much as I can like believe it to be, or analyze it to be. And I always appreciated that, because when I thought of an SF, a Green Beret, I thought it was somebody who was always like, standing up straight, doing the right thing, and was really never about the grandeur of being in SOF. It was more about like the ability to do something that was hard, challenge yourself. and Greg was like that, So I think he really, in that sense, was the model kind of Green Beret, that I thought of.
And I can imagine that's probably, something that you needed, right? Coming onto the team, you're new, you have this person now that you can trust, that is going to tell you, something, maybe even if you don't want to hear it. And I would imagine that was probably invaluable to you as a leader.
It was, especially, when other things became rough and like, leadership, points of contention there. Like Greg was a anchor, like that actually knew, hey, this is what the right answer is. This is what needs to happen. This is what the background to this is. I've been here. I've seen this, right? He's just solid counsel. He was the team sergeant in a lot of ways that you would expect. And I know you're probably going to talk about like, him and Carl, because they both pinned E8 at the same time, right? But like, and Greg was my team sergeant just as in the same time as like Carl was on the other side. Carl's the overall team sergeant, but because we were split, Greg's not only functioning as the 18 Fox, but he was our split team's team sergeant as well.
That's something that you and I have talked about too, and it's just from my knowledge of Special Forces and working with Special Forces team, that was kind of uncommon because normally when you have a Special Forces team sergeant, that's kind of like this, it's like a first sergeant in an infantry unit. That's my position, that's my job. Whereas Carl and Greg were able to to work those roles simultaneously. You guys lost your team sergeant early, and those guys were able to fill those roles together. From what from my my background and what I've learned is that it was seamless, and the team was better because there was no bravado between those two, where they were they were just really about the mission and getting the work done.
Well, and again, these are things that you don't realize about your detachment until years later. You see a bunch of detachments, like, wow, I had you have people who don't have that kind of posturing. You have really the best of both worlds, where they're super motivated, super competent, but they're not always edging, to get ahead, and that's a hard thing, right? Because that's how the machine actually, that's how you keep advancing in the machine. I think it goes to the end of the day of their personalities, right? That they were guys who were genuinely about others and about the mission. Before there is no ego. I never saw any ego of any of them. Especially, Greg. I never saw any ego. So
that's awesome. If you could pinpoint one moment or experience during that deployment that defined Greg's character, courage, or his leadership, what would that moment be?
We had some issues with our ALP being infiltrated by the Taliban. And one of them in particular was a pretty, he was very influential, right? Kind of a rock star, if you will, in the local Afghan government. But he was, in a lot of ways, not in a lot of ways, he was nefarious behind the scenes. And there was lots of way in of what to do about that, right? Because we would have to pursue basically capturing him and removing him from that position of power, which would have disrupted a lot of power brokers and a lot of parts of the Afghan local government, whether it's tribal or in the district, who were going to be upset about that. And Greg is the intelligence NCO. I asked him, and a guy who'd been around a long time. I'm like, what do you think we should do about this? And he was very, again, humorous. It was always a joke, kind of right off the bat. But he was like, no, this is what we have to do. This is what we have to do to make a difference, out here. Otherwise, nothing's going to change, right? They're gonna keep kind of just laying low and moving behind the scenes, and they're just going to wait us out, right? And after we're gone, then they're going to turn on the entire, kind of Afghan government and cut them out from the the area. So Greg was the one who really gave me the counsel and advice of how to negotiate that with the other tribal elders, how to approach that when we go in there and talk to the other elders. He's like, here's I've seen this. Here's a good technique. Here's how they kind of respond to this. Here's how you should present this. So one, he helped me really prep a lot of times going to talk to the local Afghans, but he also prepped the whole packet. to go up to SOTIF, right? To actually do the intelligence legwork behind it, to make it justified that we could nominate him on the list, and eventually, they came and we got him detained, right? So that's one of the most, I think, impressive parts of that deployment. Prior to that, when we previously deployed, Greg always, Greg, I think Greg defended me behind the scenes at times, maybe unbeknownst to me, but I felt that, right? I felt like Greg, because you always mess up. Like I feel like Greg helped solidify that I was a valuable leader to the team early on. We know when I had made mistakes that, like, hey, he's a good captain. He's worth keeping at least around for a bit.
As you think about that now, what does that mean to you?
Well, everything, right? I know tons of captains who they bolo something on their team, and that's the end of them, right? And that's the end of them in SF. And in SF, you leave your branch, your basic branch. It's not like you're going to go back to the infantry, right? Where like, oh, you messed up, you're back to the infantry. Like, you're basically just your mobility kill, right? You're not moving anymore inside the Army, and the only way there is, kind of out at that point. And then, that's all I ever wanted to do was be in the Army. And especially, I wanted to be an SF guy. So, like, this is your point to do what you always wanted to do. So when you make a mistake, it is, how do you recover from that? Well, you recover from that from grace. People show you grace along the way. Sometimes grace is from your leadership. It's also from your subordinates too, right? And I owe everything from Greg, right? Showing me grace, and almost really and encouraging me too. They're like, whatever, we all mess up. It's not a big deal. So anyway.
That's awesome. ODA 3424 had a reputation for being a band of brothers. Guys like Mike Swinson, Carl Hoover, Tim Bostian, and Dovid Berg, who we're going to hear from later on in the series. How did Greg's presence shape the team's chemistry, and what role did he play in keeping everyone grounded?
Well, I've mentioned his humor. Greg was a guy that everybody loved. And I mean, the whole team got along great, which I think is another mark of how the team is so good, is how well it got along together. There was never a clique on the team. There was never cliques, right? But there's someone, there's just those who are, everybody always like, well, let's go ask what he thinks. Greg was always the one to let's go ask what Greg thinks, right? And that was in anything, we were on TDY, hey, where are we gonna go eat? Hey, Greg, what do you think, right? He was besides his position, which was obviously, leadership, he was always a silent influencer along the way. And I noticed that early on, like I said, when I got to the team, when he was just the echo on the detachment. The old hands, right, would ask, hey, Greg, what do you think, man, right? He clearly had a lot of just, silent influence. So that was something that he had. But I think it's his humor, right? Greg was always the one who made us laugh. It was always funny when Greg was around. Even, like I said, whatever the dire circumstance that it was, Greg was always funny.
Yeah, I can hear Carl in the background. Carl, I remember Carl early telling me how Greg loved teen pop music and would be singing Kesha in the back and playing that. So
that might be it's one of my favorite memories of Greg, right? Is the Kesha, playing Kesha, and I'll tell you that specifically here. Not the bravado that you probably want, but in a lot of ways I think that's probably what Greg would want to hear anyway. So we had got some intelligence about heavy Taliban activity in the area, right? And I told you, he was very intimately knew a lot of the problems that were behind the scenes because of his experience on the previous rotation. But he played Blow by Kesha, right? Which the lines, this place is about to blow. So that was his little joke while we were talking about oh, what are we gonna do here in the sector, right? Things are enemy activities picking up. He just turned on Kesha, this is place about to blow. And he starts dancing, right? And that's Greg. And it's really one of my fondest memories of just because it wasn't that he wasn't gonna not do the work or behind it, right? But it was just hey, life's short. You gotta have fun once in a while.
That's awesome. I've always appreciated people, with humor. Sometimes, especially in our field with all the dark things that we've had to deal with, it's always good to find the funny moments because it's still life.
That's right. Yeah.
You work closely with ODA 3422, and I know your friend
Sean A.
ran that detachment. We've talked to him as well, and that was your guys' sister team, really. And Kevin Robbins was over there. And your team captains, you guys went to West Point together, you and Sean A. How did Greg's relationship with both teams strengthen the mission, and what was it like seeing him operate in the broader brotherhood?
Yeah. So, your team's your team, right? Like SF's like concentric circles of you're with this guys and with this guys. So I think it's important to note that 2-2 is across the hallway from us, right? Like as our team rooms were organized, right? So obviously all of Bravo Company is clustered together, but for whatever they when the first Sergeant Major was building it, they're like, put this team here and put that team there, right? Because you would think maybe it'd be 2-3 over here, but so it's 2-2 and 2-4 right across the hallway from each other. So you end up seeing them a lot just by virtue of you're walking by each other. And the 2-2 and 2-4 already had this amazing relationship beyond just Sean A. and me anyway, right? Their team sergeant, Tommy Meyer, was, long hand in third group, awesome dude, known to be probably one of the most solid NCOs. And his approach to training was absolutely solid. Really so much so that they had such a solid training plan, right? In a lot of ways, we snap linked into it, right? I kind of owe a lot of the great training that we did early on in my team time. I owe it to Sean A. and Tommy Meyer. They helped build that, right? And we snap linked in with them, right? Because they did a lot of the legwork, right, to kind of set up these training events. So point being, we went on a lot of combined. They're called. What do we call them? RMTs, realistic mission training or military training, something like that, right? Where you do off-post training concepts. We did a lot of ours together. Back at the time, I know budgets are far less now than they were then. I think about that. We used to complain about the budgets then. But if you could do multiple detachments together on a training event, it was more likely that it was going to get sourced. So we just kind of hey, we're going to work together and we're going to go forward. Point of all that is that Greg knew all those guys very intimately because he'd been around the company for so long, right? One of the original guys in 4th Battalion when they helped stand it up from the other parts of 3rd Group. So he had all these relationships and he knew all these things. He'd already we'd already done that. I've done that for my previous battalion. I did that from that previous rotation. So he helped build that bond very closely too. And half the time, Greg wasn't even there for those events, right? I talk about, there's just kind of unending amounts of work that Greg did. Greg did a ton of other schools, like I mentioned, right, prior to that deployment. And he would come in, I remember this, he'd be in the Fox course. That's long and arduous. That's a long and arduous course. It's a lot of academic load, lots of late nights. Greg would still come into the team room to work on something. Hey, I know I got to knock out this part of this mission concept, or I need to write this part of the report, and I know I need to do this. And, I'm working on, while I'm learning to be a Fox, I am the Fox, so I'm doing the Fox work for this upcoming deployment. Of course, then they're changing the location constantly. So, and part of that, too, is because when we identified to actually be with 2-2, because 2-2 was co-located with us, probably because we trained together so much, right? They were the ones up at Shindan. Greg built in a strong relationship, to really understand what they, to build that intelligence picture between our two detachments being the same. I think it's also important to note that Greg, on his deployment to Zerko, he had the mission that 2-2 had, right? That was his old team house, right? That 2-2 was at from that trip. So I think it was very, just felt very at home to him. And I think he actually would show them oh yeah, this is where, you probably don't know this, but there's an extra door here, right? It goes into this cellar or whatever it is, right? So he was just kind of always around. And Greg built that relationship across the regiment. And he did it also too with, when I mentioned we were with MARSOC. So he had a great relationship with MARSOC's intelligence section. So much so, this is another thing I think it's important to note, especially about SF, because SF is the jack of all trades, right? Swiss Army knife of SOF. I remember the intel section from MARSOC calling down. They're like, oh, we want to talk to your intel guy. I'm like, well, he's on patrol right now. Like, what do you mean he's on patrol? Why isn't he an intel guy? I'm like, in SF, our intel guy actually is an operator too, right? Like it's the same person, right? So he's out there doing that, and like that. Wait a second, that guy, that's not his primary job, like because that blew their mind because he was producing so much intelligence products, right? They did not know that was like basically the side hustle that Greg had, besides being the team sergeant, of one split team site, and besides going on patrol, and also, basically it was one of our echoes too, because David was the only echo. So Greg was uplifting as the other echo, constantly running the comms, making sure all the comms were ready to go too. I think it's really impossible to describe how much Greg's always around, right? You look here in this corner, Greg's doing this. You look here in that corner on that truck, Greg's doing something else.
That's a great point. Before we started rolling, we were actually talking about intelligence, just with my group. I have an intelligence background, and there's a lot of things that people don't understand that go on behind the scenes. You watch a Jason Bourne movie where, Jason Bourne's doing all the spy stuff, or James Bond. What you don't see is the 12 hours that dude spent writing intelligence reports to get that stuff out. So, there's a lot of things just from listening to you talk, and then my own experience of knowing how intelligence works, of how much typing and writing, and he was doing all of that on top of, helping being an echo, and going out on patrols and doing the mission. So that's a great overview. Afghanistan in 2012 was a brutal theater. Taliban maneuvering on you guys, unlike the ghosts kind of Iraq. You and I were talking about that, actually early this morning, of how, the Afghanistan was so much different than Iraq. A lot of Iraq was IEDs, and you don't really get a chance to fight. You're getting rocketed, you're getting mortared, and you just want to fight. Afghanistan was a little bit different. You guys were getting an opportunity to really fight. What was it like leading Greg and your team through that chaos, knowing every patrol, could be the one that changes everything?
Yeah, I think this is something I did learn in Iraq, right? Although Iraq was a lot more kind of constant and in your face, from the frequency of attack, but different nature, right? Like getting hit by IEDs and like taking rockets and like pot shots down the street, although constant in volume, is different than like sustained contact that you engage in, that you would encounter in Afghanistan. And the physical toll in Afghanistan was a lot greater I think. One, it's just as hot in Afghanistan as it is in Iraq. It's also extremely cold. That's like Alaska cold in Afghanistan too.
Coldest I've ever been was in
right?
Afghanistan.
Yeah. Unlike Iraq, which is the winter is beautiful, man. It's the best time of year, right? The altitude, the elevation. Afghanistan is hard and rugged, right? Iraq's confusing, right? Afghanistan's confusion is really about the population, right? That they have a very tribal and insular culture that you really can't kind of penetrate. So I think the biggest thing to me about leading that was you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't have, like when I was in the infantry, you have the big machine behind you, right? Yes, you're out there wherever you are at the spear, but there's a big machine behind you, right? There's a lot of other dudes running around in green. In SF, you're alone a lot, right? It's just you guys. So you have to rely on each other, and you have to be a lot more like on your guard, on your game. At that time in Afghanistan, there was a lot of insider threats. We were fortunate, probably because of our hyper paranoia in that sense, right? To constantly vet against that. But unfortunately, I want to say some of the MARSOC teams up north had an insider threat, kill an operator, and I want to say it happened to one of the SEAL platoons in our SOTF too, I believe. But we had several insider threats, right? And then most of them were always out in the West, so that kind of fear is very pervasive, right? This idea that you're, and I think that's a good combat advisor takeaway, right? Which is different than the infantry, right? In the infantry, you're with the big flag, big green machine. Even when you're out in the woods, still a big green machine. In SF, when you're doing combat advisory roles with indigenous forces, you never really know quite how much to trust them, especially at that point in time, right, where you're the one at the disadvantage of that, right? So that element of never really knowing what's over the horizon whether this engagement, which is very friendly and cordial, is going to go hot, right? If they're going to turn on you, that's there. And I think the other idea too is that that silence of Afghanistan is lulling. It gives you this lulled sense of like calm about the place, because it is. I think it has a beauty to it.
Oh, it definitely has beauty to it.
I think it's amazingly beautiful, but that sense of like peace of the earth can rapidly be shattered. So you have to have this dichotomy of thought, right? But you can't let it like be all encompassing of your mind, because then you can't think. And I think the hardest thing as a leader is to put your own like independent. But I think this is a truth of all special operators, right? Because I've seen them this way, and I think maybe different than some of the other regular forces. You can't afford to be thinking only about yourself and your self-preservation when you're in that type of role, right? You have to think, yes, you're doing that, and you're doing the things that are going to keep you alive, right? Like watch where you're walking, right? Don't step on a pressure plate, right? Like scan ahead to this area. Like I'm doing my part as an individual soldier here to keep myself and my section, like secure. But you have to have like higher simultaneously. Those are actually like autonomous functions, like breathing. Like that's like breathing. The higher functionality is like, where are we going next? What's going on? What if this? Right? What am I doing later? Like I have to engage with these people from this tribe later on for the sure. When we get back from this briefing, I have to write this report. Like all these things are happening simultaneously. And I think the hardest thing to do is to train that kind of cognitive, or to execute that kind of cognitive load and not become selfish about yourself, right? That's the hardest thing. And the only way to really, I think, do that is to rely on each other for that. And Greg's a guy who was a go-to dude for that, right? Like I knew, like, hey, I'm smoked. I don't know if I'm going to be able to write this X sum, right, effectively. Like, just take a look at this. Can you help write this part? Greg was always there, right? And again, he's an amazing writer, right? He had a lot of other academic skills that you may not think, right? Like, yeah, I'll bang that out. Super smoked, super tired, walking all day through the mountains. We got to write reports. That's part of, like you said, part of the job, right? Greg's
something
there.
You don't see in the recruiting video.
Greg's burning away on paperwork there. Like here, I helped you out with that. Right here, I did this. So he took a lot of that cognitive load out too, and it's the little things too, right? Like, hey, Greg would come up with like, hey, we were going on patrol. I don't need to spot check. I will a little bit, right? But like, I know that Greg did his job and he spot checked half of it anyway, right? I know that Carl did that. I know that it didn't even need spot check half the time because like Dylan and Cray are so exacting in their maintenance of the gun, right? It's almost formality. And I think that's what makes a good team, is that like, because they're always doing the little things, you don't have to burn a bunch of cognitive load doing the what ifs of like, well, did that really get done, right? And like, then you become micromanaging, right? Like you can be a very effective hands-off leader when your individuals are self-motivated, self-starters. And Greg's obviously one of them. So I think that's a unique thing about leading troops in that kind of deployment.
We're going to set up a little bit some of the teammate stories.
Yep.
Mike Swinson, your warrant on the team. He was kind of one of your technical expert, not only by trade of warrant, but Mike was a former sapper,
Yep.
had an idea. We're going to hear some stories later on how that dude was able to like laser find IEDs that most people probably would have never seen. How did Greg and Mike complement each other during the deployment? And maybe what, if you have one, kind of a story that showed a little bit of their teamwork.
Yeah, so Mike obviously was very new to the team right before the deployment, right? Like he literally came on like within, like a few weeks, right? Like at most a month, right? He had just completed the warrant course, so we got a new warrant. And I think the key out of that for Greg is that I didn't have a warrant for a long period of time, right? Like I had a warrant early on when I first got to the team, but he had left. He went off to B-23. So we were warrantless. So I didn't really grow up on the team, like this is over a year of my time on the team at this point. I'm pretty solidly I kind of know how things are working. I didn't really know what to do with a warrant. I'm like, what do I do? And that's not really taught very well in the Q course either, right? Because when you go through the Q course, all the MOSs are together except the warrants, because warrants come from their previous MOS and SF. They don't have to go back through the Q course, right? So even when you're going through Sage and all these, there's nobody really who's a warrant showing you this is what the warrant's going to do on the rotation. And Greg was again a sage piece of advice, well, here's what the warrant should be doing, and here's why that matters too, because everything in SF is split in twos. It's the rules. It's 12 men, but it's all equal, right? There's 2 operations guys. There's the Alpha and the team sergeant. There's 2 weapons, 2 Bravos, 2 Charlies, 2 Deltas, 2 Echoes. There's 2 intel guys too, technically. That's the Fox, and the other part of that is the warrant. And you have to really kind of go back legacy-wise too, because the warrant wasn't always, when the SF ODA was first created, that was another officer position, right? That was a second. That was more of a team XO, right? Than a warrant, right? So that position evolved over time, and it's not always the same. It's really based off the strength of the warrant, I've come to find out, right? What the warrant does has a lot to do with what the warrant's skills are, right? He is officially the assistant detachment commander, but that can be a lot of different kind of functions and roles depending on what it is. But Mike had a strong intelligence background too, so Greg and Mike were the brains of the entire intelligence apparatus, right, that we had as a detachment. Collecting our collection plan, processing it, what it meant, recommendations to me of what to do with it, right? So they were always working hand in hand, and they had their little, it's the compartmentalized room, right, where only those right on for that particular part could work on those programs, and they were always in there, and I just remember hearing. Pretty funny story, pretty funny jokes coming out of there constantly. Mike's very dry in that sense, right? He's got that New York personality. But yeah, they were always, working together on that very effectively.
Carl Hoover, your team sergeant and your medic, was right there with Greg in the thick of it. From your view as a captain, how did Greg and Carl's bond shape the team's ability to keep fighting?
Yeah, they have something that I never really totally understood, right? They had been there. They're like the oldest, guys basically. Especially after we lost our team sergeant, right? They had to take on that role, and how they came to that in a cooperative manner, right? I'll never really know other than the fact that they were good friends, right? Like they just got along well. But the funny thing about Carl and Greg is they're probably the funniest dudes of the whole team, right? Greg was overtly funny, right? It's kind of slapstick style. Carl is this, very mischievous, kind of humor, right? But they would feed off of each other constantly, right? It was almost like a escalation of humor, right? I got a joke. Well, I got a joke. I got a joke for you. I got a joke for you, right? To see them together, screwing off and just, having fun it's probably some of the funniest things I can remember, just to watch them talk. You could just sit there and watch. It would be it was like an improv comedy, right? To watch Carl and Greg talk to each other. It was hilarious.
That's funny. Tim Bostian, Dovid Berg, they were also key players on your team. With Dovid earning an award for valor during the incident, how did Greg's leadership influence guys like Tim and Dovid? And what did you see in their reactions of him?
Yeah. Well, I know they're not going to be with it, but I want to mention, Dylan and Cray and, Pat, Bart. Greg was influential to all of them, right? Especially, Dylan, who had been there on the team a long time. Dylan, Red, and Greg were Tim. As I call Tim Red. but they were on that team originally before everybody else kind of came, right? Like when I talk about when I showed up, the dudes who had already been there, it was them. So they had been on a previous rotation together, and they looked at Greg as somebody who knew what he knew what was going on, because that wasn't his first rodeo, right? He'd been in a long time. He had a lot of deployments under his belt. So he was this cool, like kind of steady knowledge of like, let me show you what to do. For David specifically, Greg was a senior echo de facto, right? Because that's what he was. David was new to SF, kind of like the junior echo, but he couldn't afford to be the junior echo because he's our only echo in that sense, right? Greg is literally, that's his part-time job to be the echo. So Greg's mentorship to David of like, hey, here's how to be a good echo was always there. And I think it's the kind of the always thing, right? You never not saw Greg doing something, right? Like the little things constantly are going on behind the scenes. While Greg's doing all that, he's teaching David, right? Like, here's how you be a good echo. Here's what you got to do. Here's how you do the commo requests, right? Like all these little things that they don't teach you in the, the echo course, right? They teach you how to run the radios, but all those other things that matter, right? Like Greg was there to mentor David along the way. I think that was a very important relationship that they had. I really can't play enough how close Tim and Greg are, or were, I should say, family and besides personally, right? I think from a relationship wise, and Pat and Greg, they have their moment out where they received their Valor Awards too for like a different incident together. They held off an entire sector on their own. But I think that relationships are, based off time in a lot of cases, right? Like most bonds of time, Tim and Greg and Dylan being together so long, like it was a very, very close bond, right?
Yeah. And then lastly, Kevin Robbins from ODA 3422 was part of that sister team operating nearby. What was Greg's role in bridging the two teams, and how did his presence impact joint operations?
Yeah, so we would do a lot of combined, it's technically not combined is the military term, but like combined operations, right, with 2-2 for a multitude of reasons, right? Like they had the Commando Kandak, as our area got more and more enemy activity. It's actually really hard to generate combat power, when you're on the village stability operations mission, and that was also not primarily the intent. The intent, you almost could say good cop, bad cop, right? Like our job was to be the good cops, right? No pun intended, because we're building local Afghan police. But they didn't want to create this friction that we're this kind of outside force that's, living all those stereotypes of the Americans coming in and like crashing and breaking things in the local population. So the Commando Kandaks did a lot of that direct action role indirectly across the entire area. So we had like a mutual supporting effort with that. So we do combined operations with them. But the targeting, right, that Greg was developing from his intelligence role, those personalities, hey, this is a bad guy, this is an area of interest, the things that we couldn't really go after because we didn't have the combat power, or really that's not what we should have been focusing on. Our focus was primarily about building local security. That would be passed off directly to 2-2 and their Commando Kandak. They would be the strike element to go after a lot of those target packets. So, that relationship's constant, with constantly Greg on the phone, calling back to 2-2, working that. And really that was, Shinden was our arrest and refit area anyway, right? We had our little base, our fire base out there. But Shinden was only, could be an hour to 3 hours, depending on, which route you went to get to it. But it really wasn't that far. It was probably only 20 miles, right? That's just how long it takes to move around Afghanistan. But when we went up there, we'd stay with 2-2 and their team house. So, and again, always Greg was there, building relationships. Like the first thing when we got there is Greg was going to go get an intel update. That's like the first thing Greg ever did. Before everybody else is trying to go to the PX or whatever, go get showers. Greg's going to do like something that was duty first in that sense.
Awesome. Well, before we dive deep into that day, let's just take a little break for a second.
Yep.
Cool, man. Coming back from the break, we're getting ready to dive in into really, the guts of the story. Well, I mean, not the guts of the story. I think the whole story as a whole is really the story. But, we're going to talk about, what happened that day. So, Dave, if you could dive in to 2012 when Greg was shot, what do you remember most? The sounds, the silent, the weight hitting you as the team captain. Can you take us there that day?
Yeah, I'm sure you'll ask kind of specifics along the way, but I think the whole day itself it's very much, you'd ask earlier, what's it like to know every minute you can walk could be the last minute? Well, most of the time when you do that, you know that, but it's not the last minute. You come back. You make it back from whatever that is, right? Sometimes it's hairy, and everybody comes back. Sometimes it's actually, most of the time, it's painfully boring, right? Having, that third deployment at that point in time in my career, most of the time, boring, painfully boring. But it's the moments where it's not like that's what you remember the rest of your life, right? So, that's a mission that began as a very boring mission, and turns into like Ranger School level selection, suck fest. Across the board, right? From endurance, heat, sleep deprivation, and tragedy along the way, right? And it just goes to show you never. It's like most of the time when I take about my experience of all the military, I take something that you see the world through diamond eyes, like how precious life is. It's easy to forget that, in my driving around, take your kids to school, whatever. Even I forget it. But I remember stuff like this and like, hey, you never know when it's the end. And I think that's the most poignant thing about that day. You wake up and you think it's nothing, and by the end of the day, it's something. And that's warfare kind of just in a nutshell. You never know what's on the next ridge line waiting for you.
Can you talk us through what happened that day? Maybe kind of start, just so the listeners can appreciate what you guys were doing the night before, and kind of set that scene and how that led up into the next morning.
Yeah. So, our sector, as the fighting season ramped up, the Taliban had gone after us a couple times, right? But generally, they know not to mess with, the U.S. military, and especially, SF's got a great reputation, obviously, for our fighting prowess. Most of the time they were going after our partner force. So they slowly ate away at them, right? Like attacking them at night, a campaign of intimidation, assassinations against local leaders, right? Just slowly chewing away at our actual partner force. So that by that point in time, which is pretty deep into the deployment, we had lost a lot of our Afghan local police, like a lot. And there was solid fear in the Afghan local police that the Taliban were systematically going after them.
If I remember you telling me, not to interrupt you, is like, man, you guys were getting calls that dudes were getting executed in broad daylight, or they'd be at a market and they'd smoke a couple of the dudes, and then the checkpoints were getting hit at night.
Yeah, I had a really close. I'll call him a friend. It'd be difficult to describe to others this relationship you have, but I had an old Afghan. Right, he probably wasn't old. He was probably my age now, right? But to an Afghan, that's ancient, and he looked grizzled and weathered. The dude had been around long enough to remember, so he probably would have been older than I guess my current age, but he was old enough to remember the Soviet war and the Soviet occupation. Gave me some thoughts about what the Soviets did in that valley versus American approach. Super just interesting, but we had a very close relationship, and he mentored me a lot just on Afghan culture. I would say he was a friend, but he told me one time, he's like, they're trying to kill me because I'm helping you, and they're going to try and kill me. And I was like, well, we'll keep you safe, whatever. And yeah, he was executed riding his, little motorcycles, whatever. They're not like hogs like we have, right? But they're little motorcycles. Yeah, he was in Shindan downtown and just got capped gang warfare style, right? So. And that was very emotional for me, right? But that's that kind of whole sense of this is happening constantly, right? There's also a lot of other tribal kind of dynamics in the valley. I remember we interceded on this civil war on a block right, one time between two families fighting over like fig trees, right? Like, you know, when you're so poor in that area, like a lot of what was undercurrent of the Taliban that they were taking advantage of was just the poverty and the desperation of the area anyway. But yes, we are losing Afghan local police constantly, and our sector's kind of collapsing almost. That's a lot of heavy weight on me. You know, my job is to win. You know, my job as the team leader is to win, like one for the nation. Right? You didn't come here to fail, and especially like your name's on the reputation line here, right? I feel like our sector's failing. So to bulk this up, we did a deliberate campaign of old school SF stuff. That's what I thought of it, at least, right? We're going to go balk and tackle, spend time with our indigenous forces. We're going to be a good partnering force. So what we would do is rotate every night. We'd spend out into the towns, and we'd stay with a different ALP checkpoint overnight, just to give them confidence that we're here with you. If they come in the morning, they often attacked it. When the French and Indians attack, as the Ranger Creed says, or that's actually Roger's orders. Sorry, but when they attack in the morning, we're going to be here with you, waiting. Right, we'll be with you. We're not going to be left behind. So we were doing that, and that previous night we had been out all night with one of the Afghan local police checkpoints, spending the night with them, and it's a good chance to build rapport, all that Green Beret stuff that you should be doing, right? So we were up all night. Nothing happened, of course, right? You're just exhausted, and it's really the end of that patrol. The sun comes up. We're like, okay, guys, we'll see you later on. Next time we rotate through you. So we're driving back to the fire base, and we got a call on the phone from one of our ALP commanders that, like, his checkpoint, he was one of the main commanders, deep inside the valley, because that night we'd stay more one of the peripheral ones on the kind of external edge of the valley, really more where the desert started. We got a call that, like, he was under heavy contact, like he's taking a lot of fire. So the MO was usually if they were going to attack, it was going to be relatively short, or it was going to be longer. So we're kind of waiting to see, hey, let's see what this means. This is a long way to go. We're smoked. We've been up all night, all day previously with this other checkpoint. Let's kind of see what happens here. So really on the way back is where we get this call. So we really stop short of the fire base. We're really there at the fire base, right? And we're waiting for the situation to develop. We're talking to the Afghan local police. And then really one of the first things we did there, our previous fire base on the other side of San Juan, right, which we had transitioned over when we consolidated together as the entire detachment on really the worst side of the valley. We had transitioned that to the Afghan National Army. So there's an Afghan National Army, part of a Kandak battalion, Afghan A&A battalion that was on the other side. So we immediately called them up, like, here's your chance to shine for, God, country, and Afghanistan, right? Like, get your boys up, let's go, and we can prepare to go relieve these guys. And the first thing as an SF guy that your answer should always be is, how do I get the indigenous forces to do this on their own, right? That is your objective as Green Beret, is how do I get the indigenous forces to do this on their own? Because our goal is not to put American troops at risk. That's SF's role. We fight by, with, and through. So they're spinning off and really giving me the slow roll because it's early and everybody's kind of dragging. That's the nature of the Afghan summer. People just drag. This from Iraq too, right? Like, they just sit on their rooftops and sleep all day because it's so hot, right? So anyway, we're trying to spin up the A&A to help be a part of this as well. But the fight just kind of keeps driving up, and I realized I couldn't tell you how long it is, right? It's probably not that long. This is probably not that long of a period of time. It feels like hours, though. That we're going to have to go and relieve the Afghan ALP, the Afghan local police checkpoint. We're going to have to go in there and relieve it, actually break its contact.
And how are you guys getting, like, at that point, were you guys getting radio comms from the Afghans?
Yeah, we're talking, we have,
we're
talking on the old Roshan phone, but we also have actual radio comms. The ALP although not kitted out like the Afghan National Army, they did have equipment, right? So they have radios, they have weapons, right? They had vehicles, like they actually have all this equipment, right? Which is, provided for them as part of the package too, right? So like we're able to talk to them, we have our interpreter with us, right? He's like, and I tell you, unsung heroes of the Afghan war are our Terps. And we all know that, afterwards, how it went down. But like those dudes were everything with us. Always in my hip pocket. 2 dudes in my hip pocket constantly. My JTAC, Rich, Shady. I can't remember Shady's first name even, but we just called him Shady. First JTAC on that trip. Second one was Rich, right? CCTs, AFSOC dudes, solid operators. He's in my hip pocket, controlling air. And then my Terp, controlling the indige, right? Like helping to communicate with them. Because obviously I don't speak Pashto. So we're talking to them and developing the situation. But like I said, it becomes very obvious we're going to have to go in there and do something because the attack is getting so severe and they're losing people there. And we cannot afford to lose this ALP checkpoint. This is very central to that part of the valley. That's one of our critical ALP commanders. I think I mentioned earlier how one of our other, bright stars of the ALP was shown to be corrupt, and we, had to be removed and detained, and that created a huge vacuum of like competent ALP leadership. And this is like one of the last guys, right? If this falls, it's very possible the whole valley falls. Is that true? I don't know. That's what's in your mind, right? You have to do something about this. The initial idea was to really do a lot of demonstrations, right? To prevent to go in there and get into contact directly. I knew it was a bad environment to be, fighting in. It was deep inside. It's difficult if you hadn't been to Afghanistan, but if you have, it's like it's deep in one of these green zones, right? As we would have called them. But if you don't know what that is, right? It's deep, kind of farm clustered areas. These villages don't have roads in that sense, so it's not like you're driving in there. And what does that mean for us? We can't bring to bear our vehicles, which is a majority of our combat power that we're able to generate, because they have heavy caliber weapons, whether it's 50 cal, 249, or not 249, 40 millimeter grenade launchers, right, miniguns, whatever it is. That's all mounted cruise serve weapon systems on these vehicles. The vehicles are also heavily armored, right, so they give us a level of protection. They give us a level of comms, right? They give us a level of speed and mobility. The inability to use our vehicles creates a disadvantage where you're now one-on-one, infantryman to infantryman in that sense. And I don't care how good you are in that sense, those are difficult fights, when you're dismounted. So I knew it was a difficult fight, and that would be waiting for us if we had to go in there because we couldn't get the vehicles in there. We'd have to go dismounted.
Were you hearing on comms that, the situation, like the Afghans were starting to get stressed out? Was your Terp,
yeah.
relaying?
They had lost, they had several people killed already, I can't remember the exact numbers. The ALP had lost several people, either killed or wounded by that point in time, right? And really the holdup, besides trying to do these demonstrations, right? We brought some aircraft on station, but it's difficult at that point in time, because of the proximity of civilian structures. There's really no ability to distinguish who's who, right? Or to drop rounds in that kind of built up. It's built up in a relative sense, right? There's civilian structures, so you're not going to be able to employ ordnance. Really, what we're waiting for is the Afghan National Army to mobilize, because I need sufficient combat power for dismounts to go in there. You can't go in there as an ODA. An ODA is not an infantry squad, right? It is a highly capable element, but it has to be used as such, right? Commanding a larger element of indigenous forces. So we're really trying to assemble the necessary indigenous capability from the Afghan National Army. Once they were finally arrived on site, right? And again, I tried to do several feints to convince the Taliban that we were about to do something and maybe get them to break their attack. But unfortunately, I was unsuccessful. So we had to go in there. Once I had the A&A with me, I think I had about a platoon of A&A with us, and then a couple other hodgepodge ALP personnel who had we were able to cobble them together because they're usually manning their checkpoints. So it's not like you can just abandon your checkpoints along the way and consolidate all ALP. They're very much tied to the checkpoints that they were manning. So we got sufficient combat power. We're proceeding in there, go as far as we can on the vehicles, We have to vehicle drop off there, corral the vehicles, right? And along the way, I think it's important to note that like there's distributed, like people are at different points. There are people from the team. The team is still manning the fire base. Pat's there. Cray's there, right, at the fire base, because the fire base has to be manned. And again, part of the infantry platoon's there manning security, right? Your civil affairs teams there, your PSYOPs teams, all that's there. Then you have, like Dylan was with the vehicles, right? And a couple of the infantry guys, like holding the vehicle drop-off point perimeter there, because you can't, vehicles have to stay.
Yeah, you guys were on offset when you guys actually went on foot. Like you guys were like, what, 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers away offset, or maybe more?
Yeah. I think everything seems really far, right? Especially when it's 120 degrees, because that's about what the heat was. But yeah, it's about 1 kilometer, maybe a kilometer and a half from the vehicles. We probably had a good, I want to say we had 30 to 40 dismounts with us at least, right? Like, although most of them are not Americans, right? They're Afghans. And again, you got to like go to the mindset of the time. Lots of green on blue insider threat incidents, right? So it's not as classic like, oh yeah, we're all hand in hand, right? There's an element of like, I don't know if these folks are going to turn on me right now, right? Or they're not always the best trained, right? Like they might just hit you by accident, right? So we kind of broke up the formation of placing the A&A on this portion here, and us moving abreast, to their lateral portion as we moved and bounded into that kind of built up farming green zone.
So as you guys kind of, you get there, you get the A&A kind of on station with you. You guys park your trucks and you guys start bounding in.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what's going on in the gunfight? I mean, can you hear it? Does it sound like
it's loud, right? It's actually, and even early on, right, when it first happened, it's close enough to the fire base, like the actual point of direct contact. You can hear it out there, right? You can hear the pops. It's like popcorn. It's like popcorn out there far away. And you'll hear like the reports of like the RPG, right? Like when it impacts, right? So that was very consistent. And I want to say from initial kind of contact to mobilization and all that, it was maybe 30 to 40 minutes before we're able to actually like initiate movement in there by consolidating everyone. So that's 30 to 40 minutes of sustained contact that the Afghans have, inside the area. And that's stressful. It's ramping you up, right? Like, hey, we got to move faster, we got to move faster, we got to move faster, but you can't move so fast that you're not ready to go, right? These are the things that you have to measure in your mind is like, do we have enough force to go in here yet? Do we not? So anyway, you can hear it. It's getting louder, and really, it's not that far that we make it in from the vehicle drop-off point before we start taking extremely heavy, effective small arms fire. Probably some of the most effective small arms fire that I've ever received in my entire career. Very close. It does sound extremely different when it's right next to you, like the incoming rounds. They do have a difference, right? Like there's a difference of overhead, side, but when it's close, you can tell. You can tell.
That popping and that cracking is kind of unmistakable.
Yeah, like you can hear that sonic boom snap right past you.
So you're in the gunfight. You're taking effective fire.
Yep.
You have these A&A elements maneuvering with you. You have your team. What's going through your mind?
I think the idea of how to effectively function in combat is focus. Like you're focusing on what your job is. The moment you start to like break away from like what you're focusing on is like that's the point of doom for a lot of things, right? Because one, you forget what to do, but your mind starts to go other places. So my memory of like this day, I can't even recall like anything about like thinking of anything other than like what's happening, right? I will tell you though that like, and we talked about this, confusion is the word of the day in combat. I often rarely like don't understand what's happening, right? Like you're taking fire, that, but where you're taking fire from isn't always clear. You look out and scan, and like there's clumps of trees, there's buildings, there's broke out ports of because these buildings are decrepit too, right? There's blown over old buildings, right? Because they're just ancient. Afghanistan's ancient. You don't really know where the fire's coming from. So there's this necessity to really take in what's happening. And that's one for you. You have to do that individually as a soldier, like to survive, right? And employ your own weapon system. But the other function that I have to do is really understand what's happening collectively, right? Like what is the Afghan army guys, the A&A dudes, laterally to me, what do they see? And that's not easy to do because I can't call them on the radio. I have to work through, my Terp. Like, what do they say? Well, they say this, and it's not always. They don't use military terms in the sense that we would, right? So it's not, they don't have our SOP. Yeah, it's on the north side or whatever our terminology is. I'm taking effective fire from this, right? Vector you in. I'm at this grid. That is not how it works when working through indigenous forces. It's a lot of like visualization of like, what are they saying? Where am I? Where are you? So you kind of, I think that's another important skill to have is like kind of a spatial detachment to visualize like the battle space where you are in relation to each other. Housing that in your mind, well, almost on a reflexive level, doing all the other things, right? So that's really the main thing. Like, what is happening here? Where am I? Where's everybody? Where's the orientation? What's still going on at that ALP checkpoint, which is under contact by this point in time? As soon as you take effective fire, and this is the advantage that we really had. Your troops in contact, you get aircraft on station, right? So we had aircraft allocated for us. So which is the other, now you have this other point, and this is where your JTAC, this is where Rich was like critical to me. Like Rich can help control the aircraft and help paint this picture to you of like what's actually happening there on the battlefield that the aircraft can see. So that's like kind of really the thing that you're trying to do is what's going on, and then what am I going to do about it, right? So when we're taking such effective fire here, it really turned into, I want to call it classic infantry, movement techniques, right? You lay down effective suppressing fire here from this section, and then we're going to bound this way and really maneuver around whatever this is, this cluster, and really develop the situation. Can you actually identify where we're taking effective fire? So that's what ended up happening in that sense, right? We're bounding forward or bounding laterally around using, and this is the other thing about Afghanistan, which is markedly different when you're doing this like there versus old Battle Drill 1 Alpha out in Area J, over here. There's no trees to bound to, right? Like these are open fields. These are long little sprints, and even your IMTs. Right, because we were IMTing, like old school, like I was in EIB lane. But when you get down, because you're getting down because you don't want to get like hit, you're still like, there's no cover out there when these large things, right? So there's this sense of like getting to cover as rapidly as possible, and cover is kind of a premium out in these desert areas, obviously, right? So, and the cover's not always beautiful in the sense where it's interspace, where your formation maintains its like spread, right, to be online, as doctrine would want you to be. It's usually like this clump of trees, this clump of bricks, this clump of hill, whatever it is. So you almost become choked together, which is exactly what you don't want to do, right? That's exactly what you don't want to be, is like you're consolidated in these like, point targets, area targets, right? But it's almost what happens in a lot of ways. So these are the dynamics of the actual on the ground, tactical maneuver of the individual. We're getting closer, and then finally got to the point where we were able to maintain and establish contact with the ALP checkpoint that was under pressure, which is also equally dicey. Like link-up's always scary, right? Especially when you're under fire, and especially when they're not Americans, right? You don't even speak the same language. So that effective link-up, hey, we're coming from this way, don't shoot this way, deconflict the fires. That was very challenging to do all through the interpreter, but we were able to establish contact with the ALP checkpoint and really by that point in time kind of assault through, and the enemy really ceased to be in contact at that point in time. I personally had thought that they had kind of broke contact and they were done for the day. Apparently they were just, in watch and shoot, as we would say. But anyway, that's kind of the point of like we reach LOA, right? A limit of advance. There doesn't seem to be any more contact, and we're going to hold in position here and to like assess the situation.
What's your last memory of Greg? You told one. You told me one right before his incident.
Yeah, and then it's that point there. That's my last memory, right? So we held up in this colot, kind of strong point in this colot, because again, it's not like Ranger School where you're in the woods, right? And you can, hey, I'm getting behind this huge oak tree, or I'm getting behind, this pine tree, on the TVA, right? Like your cover and your ability to like provide, positions to fire, fire from our buildings mostly. So we occupied this colot, which I don't even think there was anybody in there. That's the other thing too. That's strange about Afghanistan. Half these buildings are abandoned. Sometimes you'll encounter people, it's got a family, huge family, you're like, oh, okay. Other times it's just like ghostly abandoned, right? So we occupied this building. We're really just waiting, right? Waiting to see what happens. Aircraft are overhead. There's no reported movement of anything, right? So it's about time. I felt like we might have, we did it, right? But we're here waiting. It's not over yet. So Greg and I were just talking there, right? Kind of just what's going on, and it was obviously it was pretty difficult engagement there. And I remember Greg saying, that was crazy. And he goes, and he said this. He said, I'll never forget this. He goes, that's how this place used to be all the time on my first trip. It was always like this. Every time we come down here, it was like this. This is what I remember. And we never really talked about this, but you and I, Greg firmly believed he wasn't going to make it back from that trip. Firmly. He had told me that tons of times. He told other people that too. We didn't talk about that at that point in time, obviously. But he just said, like, this is how I remember it. And so, there's not a lot to say at that, other than hopefully we'll get out of here and, we'll be back at the fire base soon. But I asked him, because we've been out so long, this is my own fault for not powering down my radio for periods of time over the night. I'd already gone through all my extra batteries on my radio. We're out over 24 hours at this point, nonstop. And my battery on my embedder is not doing too hot. That's not what you want as the team leader. So I said, hey, do you have any extra batteries, Greg? You have any left? He goes, no, my radio's almost dead too. I was like, well, hey, get one of those cigarettes? He's always smoking. So he and I smoked a cigarette. I'm not a big smoker. Everybody smokes, there.
It's part of the stress.
It's part of the stress, right? And that kind of just silent moment with Greg is, I'll never forget that. It was just, I don't remember even all what we talked about. I just remember sitting there and looking at the mountains with Greg. And that's the last time I really, that's the last time we were together in that sense. Because he got hit pretty soon after that.
Where were you when you found out Greg had been shot?
Probably within 15, feet of him. It's again difficult to really remember distance in that sense, but extremely close. Right? We after this, I mentioned, and Greg and I had the cigarette, and basically, this cigarette is the timing of our departure. Right? We had been in position there for maybe 40, 50 minutes without contact. Right? Held up. There's no reported movement. ISR doesn't see anything. It appears as though there's nothing else here, right? So that cigarette is when it's done, we're literally flicked it and let's get out of here. Let's go home. So we pick up, start moving, and formation breaks down kind of in two elements. You got the one element, Overwatch, right? The first element starts moving. I'm in the lead element. Greg's a little more on the trail, second element. So we start moving. and probably not that far out of like departure, they lit us up, heavily. So they had been waiting, for us to, break contact or, start movement out of there. There's probably a lot of things I should have done differently about that, but anyway, that's when they hit us. And, massive volume of fire, luckily. There was a wall, like this little, walls that separate their fields, right? Like maybe this high, like really not only higher than this chair. Luckily, that was right there in front of us. So we were able to like all rapidly get online from this wall and take cover. And within, the first thing I do is, you take contact, your job's get on the radio. Report, assess the situation, control aircraft, bring on assets. That's what your job is. And control things. So I started getting on the radio, and I didn't see Greg get hit. Or Tim did. Yeah, and Tim's closest to me, right? Like there on the wall. I'm a little bit offset off the wall, and Greg's over here. And he said, I want to say he said, Dave, Greg's hit. I'm like, oh shit. And it's like slumped over on the wall. It pulls him down and pulls him over. And I call Carl on the radio. I said, Carl, he's the medic, obviously. It's also important to know we had one of our infantry medics with us too out there. Like I don't think Baker gets a lot of talk in this story. That's a tough fight for a young E4 infantryman, or 68 whiskey attached to an ODA. Like some heavy gunfights, right? But part of our infantry platoon was with us. Our infantry uplift was with us too, right? So I call Carl. I'm like, hey, Greg's hit. So Carl runs over, and immediately you can just tell. You can actually see, right? Like Greg's not looking like. Yeah, honestly, I thought he was dead right there on the spot because it's in his head. It clearly hit his head. You could see the impact on his helmet, front of his helmet. Like his eyes are glazed over, and you're like, I thought he was dead right there. But Carl, being the amazing 18 Delta that he is, right? Like he's like, he's still alive. And he starts working on him, and my thought of that is this. It's not silent. There's nothing silent about this at all, right? There's loud gunfire constantly, right? Because there's return of fire. The Afghans are blasting away. Our ANAs firing off their own RPGs. God knows where they're flying, right? But there's incoming fire. There's outgoing fire. But the only thing I remember is silence. It's like silence of the moment. To see Carl over him, doing whatever medic things, but almost like talking to him. I thought that's what it was. I thought he was talking to him, and so I'm just sitting there, and Tim puts his hand on his shoulder. He's like, Dave, it's okay, Dave. And I just said, I know. What are you gonna say? But I told you, my radio is about to go, dead on me. And like it's bleeping, it does that bleep, right? Like someone's dead. And I look and I see Greg's radio, and I'm like, gotta take Greg's radio, get his battery off him because my thing's about to die. And the embedder radio is a dicey thing, right? Like you get turned off before you remove the battery, otherwise it Z's out. You lose all your crypto. If you don't have crypto, you're not going to talk, right? And you only got like 5 seconds to change the battery before crypto Z's out anyway. It's because of a very small internal battery that keeps its crypto. So I'm like, this is my it's the little things like that matter. One, you can never carry enough batteries. 2 is 1, 3 is, you can never carry enough batteries. That's what I wanted out of that. I guarantee I never ran out of batteries in my life again, despite how much load it is. But pull it off his radio, took his battery, put it on mine, fire it up, and got my comms back. But that idea of like pulling pulling something off of him is like constantly in my mind of like, just him, but pulling it off of, him to use it. Meanwhile, Carl's working on him. So called in, the aircraft. They brought an F-16, which is already on station anyway. And it did some gun runs. It's part of the contact at this point in time. This is close air support. Carl's doing his thing. And really, at this point in time, we're like, well, now it's totally different. We got to get out of here, right? And we got a long way to go. It's a click and a half, right, to the vehicles.
Which is forever in a gunfight.
Yeah. Vehicles can't come in there, right? And you're like, why don't you bring the vehicles? Vehicles can't come in there. They're not going to make it. They're going to the gun trucks are too heavy. They're going to bottom out in those fields, right, and get stuck in the mud. Like, there's no way to get these vehicles here. We're going to have to evac them on foot. And, and this is also like, it's so weird, right? Like, you feel like you're having like a huddle, like at like your football team's having a huddle, like in the middle of a play. That's not what's happening, clearly, right? Because there's still engagement going on. People are like firing, but still working together at the same time. Like, we gotta get him out of here. Does anybody have a litter? Do we have a litter? Right, we don't have a litter. Like, well, we need we got firemen carry him a click and a half with like a head, gunshot wound to the head. I can't remember who said it. I said, there's litters on the vehicles. And I think Mike, I want to say Mike, was like, I'll go get him. I'll go get it. I was like, it's like a click and a half. We're under contact. You can't go get it. He's like, I can get it. And David's like, I'll go with you. And I was like, this is nuts. You can't do it. He's like, no, we can do it. We'll be back. And I said, all right. And I said, yeah, go get it. I said, I was like, you need anybody? You want to take some of the Afghans? And you're like, no, we'll move faster alone. Totally not out of Ranger School Handbook. There's no Gotwa. There's nothing, right? So, yeah, they book it.
What was it like for you to see those dudes disappear in a gunfight to go get that litter?
You're like, they're fucking dead too, right? We're all going to die. We're all going to die. No, I mean, that's a joke, but it's not a joke, right? Like, I don't know how we're going to get out of this. I mean, you're going to get out of it, kind of, because you have an F-16 overhead blasting stuff, right? But it's totally different than anything else. I mentioned, I lost guys in my infantry trip. This is like old school, like, dismounted, warfare. Like, I often think back about what, guys in Vietnam might have felt like, in the jungle, like where dudes get hit. This is kind of like what I felt they might have felt like. There's no big green machine, like power overmatch, right, that you have. I didn't know if they were going to make it back, quite frankly. So, the best thing I can see you do is focus on what you're trying to do. So I'm trying to send in reports, get the casts more effective. We're trying to really set up the 9-line. And I should say this too, that the objective primarily wasn't to move Greg a click and a half. That was not the objective. The objective was to move him way closer for an HLZ. But the birds, when we called it the 9-line, they're like, the LZ is too hot. We can't fly in the birds.
Just so our listeners understand, when somebody gets injured in combat, the ground force often they call it a 9-line, and basically that's a 9-line. There's 9 different items that go on the radio to call a medevac, which most likely is a helicopter, and you use that 9-line to talk about what the casualties, injuries are, where you're at, you're setting up a helicopter landing zone, which is what you guys are trying to do, but ultimately, as you're going to find out in this story, that the helicopters couldn't land.
They won't come. And I understand. You don't understand in the moment. I mean, but you know why. I mean, it's a high acid. It's a high acid aircraft. It's medevacs. You can't lose it. So you got to get him out of there. And anyway, before I knew it, David and Mike emerged back from the desert, the farm field, with this, litter. And I swear it was only 3 minutes, probably longer than that, but they were there and back before I knew what was going on. And they have their own story, to tell about that, how they got back there, right, and, got it and made it back. But get the litter, put Greg on the litter, and then it becomes, that's what you get assessed to do, right? Is to carry heavy stuff and like uncomfortable, like it literally was like SFAS, and like team week, you're rotating in and like carrying something very heavy. And it is 120 degrees, right? If not, and like there's no sleep, there's no food. And we're carrying him out, rotating off, carrying him to pulling security, to putting effective fire back, still controlling the Afghans who were with us. And as we got further and further away from point of contact, right, there was less and less contact, obviously. But yeah, it sucked.
Yeah, just to paint a picture, man, so everybody can understand. I understand this, you understand this, but there's people listening that may not understand this. I mean, you've been up all night. It's hot. You guys had to, pretty much walk, over probably about 2 kilometers in a gunfight.
Run,
yeah. And you guys were in a prolonged gunfight because you said you guys were sitting in the house for at least 50 minutes. And so now, you're a couple hours into this thing.
Yeah.
And now you're, not only you're tired, you're smoked, you're hot, you're wearing all your equipment. Now you're getting ready to do, the unthinkable. And, Greg wasn't a tiny person by any imagination.
No, yeah, and your kit's heavy, like, shit, you're probably 200 to 30 to 50 pounds with your kit on, right? Like, carrying like that, like that's a lot to carry. Is we got him, and we stopped multiple times too, because we tried to bring in, like, is this good enough for the bird? Is this good enough HLSD? And they're like, no, and push it back more.
Did they ever even launch?
Oh yeah, no, they were there. Yeah, they were there. They just wouldn't land because it's too close in proximity.
Dude, talk to me about the frustration of that. You can hear them, they're there, you know what I mean? And this is, this is your dude. What's that like?
It's just helplessness. Helplessness, right? Like, all you can do is like pick up and, I don't know what you want. You want it to come so you can stop carrying him, right? Because it sucks. And you want him to get help, right? Like, we're not helping him here, right? Like, I was always amazed that he like lived as long, lived a week, under obviously life support. But
I also think it's a testament. I think something that's missed in this story, as I tell it, right? Like, you guys kept him alive so his wife got to say goodbye. But there's a lot of people that never get that. And I think that's super powerful.
it is, yeah, you're begging these guys. Like, I think I remember like asking, please, can you just please like land? And, because you're talking at that point, you switch to the net directly, right? Like when they come in, you're talking to the bird directly and like basically begging for them to land. And they're like, no, he can't land. And we had to basically carry him all the way back to the vehicles, basically, right? So he landed, got him on the bird, flew away. And, like I mentioned, right, this is my memory of war. Our birds coming and taking people away forever. They're just gone. Just birds flying away. I remember that about Iraq. And, Afghanistan too. It's just gone. And like everything, you're left with the silence. There's nothing there's nothing like the silence of when the helicopter leaves, whatever that is, right? Like, you do it in training, they fly you, it's unbelievably loud, right? And drop you off, and then it leaves, and you hear that last, like, and it's just the woods, wherever you were, right? Even in Iraq, right? They fly you away, and all you hear is like the wind, dogs barking, right? Because it's like that's always out there, the dogs barking. But Afghanistan is silence. So these birds just fly away, and you just kind of left there. And all you can do then is like, well, I guess we go back to our fire base. It's just like get back in the vehicles, and you drive to the base.
Did you guys go back to your fire base?
Yeah. I mean, what do you do there? You just like go in like you go 100 times. It's like you came home, right? So you come home, throw your keys on the table, right? Like, but it's not the same. You're just like, it's so surreal.
Yeah.
It's so surreal. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to spend a couple moments and kind of talk about the impact on the team, right? I mean, in Iraq, we were just talking a minute ago, and you and I talked a lot on the prep work. You lost soldiers like, Russ Kurtz and Ryan Beam, each one kind of leaving a mark on you. How did losing Greg feel different, knowing him as you did? And what did that day do to the spirit of ODA 3424?
One of the differences of an ODA versus another formation is people a lot more intimately, right? Like, I knew my guys, right? Knew them well, we trained, but I didn't know their families as well as I knew, like, Beth. I know Gwen. So that idea of, like, the impact, like, is a lot more tangible to you because your thought is, oh my God, like, what's going to happen to Beth? And that's immediate there, right? And your wives are all close, on the backside. They talk. That's very much there. And what it did is it killed the team's like spirit. Because Greg was like that heart of that team in so many ways, right? He'd been there so long. He was its humor. He was its leadership. And its voice of sage wisdom, right? It was when that happens, you get put on you get put on stand down. Like that's I guess a fortunate thing or unfortunate, right? Of like our war that like it wasn't as like constant, so they put us on stand down, right? To like basically process everything. That's actually probably one of the worst things that can happen in a lot of ways. You just kind of stuck there thinking, think about all these things like, oh, that went wrong. Should have done this. Screwed that up. What if I had done this? What if this? What if that? And like, these are all things of chance. Because Murphy's always out there and there's always just luck. But you really start to put these things in your mind, right? And it's like poisonous. Breaks your mind apart. Yeah. Breaks your mind apart. And I think the other thing too is like this sense of like irrational hope. He's alive for like a whole week. And I don't know, Carl never alluded to us what he thought. But he's a medical professional. I think a lot of us thought maybe he's going to be all jacked up, but he's going to be okay. I think we really wanted to believe that. That wasn't the case, obviously. I think by the time he did pass away, I think it was maybe I had thought, like, he's not going to come back from this, right? Like, it appeared like, yeah, he's just on life support. But yeah, we got him home to, he was immediately like in Landstuhl by like, I want to say the end of the day of that, right? Just like the speed of evacuation is super impressive. So he was in Landstuhl in Germany by like the end of the day or something. That's like the best care. And then, got him back. I don't remember if they were able to get Beth and Gwen there to see him in Germany or like, have him back in the States.
They met him at Walter Reed, from my understanding.
They got a chance to say goodbye. I'm happy for that. And I want to believe that Greg knew that. That's what I want to believe. I believe that. I don't want to. So, yeah, I mean, the trauma of it's like undescribable.
How did your team manage the immediate aftermath of losing Greg? Who stepped up? How did you personally support your men, like Mike and Carl and Tim and Dovid and Pat and Cray and Dylan?
Yeah, well, I probably could have been better, right? I think anger was kind of like my de facto thing, right? Like, just anger, not at anybody other than the enemy, right? But I think I probably said something to the effect of like, what I had said in previous, rotations. We lost somebody that all we can do is like carry on in Greg's name because that's what Greg would want us to do. That's what Greg would expect of us. Greg wouldn't want us sitting around here like pouting. Greg would want us focused on the mission. He'd want us to keep going, and he'd probably want us to like be laughing. So all we can do, the best way to honor somebody is to carry on and not let what they did be for nothing. I said, so we're gonna, collect our shit, get ourselves together, and we're gonna keep going back out. Sometimes I think I tell that just for myself more than them.
Yeah.
Oh, but you want to know who else stepped up? Carl. I think Carl carried a lot of that burden. But, he's the team sergeant now, like the sole E8, because, a lot, Greg's actually pinned E8 while we were there, so actually 2 E8s right on that team. So now Carl's the sole team sergeant, in that sense, the only E8. And Carl had been around a long time. I think Carl's got a very zen, approach to things, right? Like he and I would have our little spiritual talks out there. But he kept, I think he kept up a lot of people's spirit.
And thinking back to your final interaction with Greg, if you could talk to him now, what would you say to him?
I would have told him, I don't think it, I don't think everybody always believed that I knew what I was doing. I kind of have imposter syndrome, like all soft guys. So there's plenty of times I felt like I didn't belong there. Greg made me feel like I belong there. Like Greg was like, no, you're doing good. I've had a lot of team leaders. You're doing good. Like this is this, and that. Like Greg kept my confidence, up. And I would have thanked him for that. I would have thanked him for his humor, for believing in me when I didn't think other people did, but I know he did. And I don't know what I would have said other than if I had known that, I would have wanted to know more about how he felt or how he knew that he wasn't going to come back. He was very adamant about this, right? Like almost supernatural. And I would have wanted to talk to him about that. because that's something that I think we search for.
You and I talked about that.
And, I mean, yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah. How did losing Greg change you personally, both as an officer and as a man?
You know, like I said, that'd been my third trip. I think at that point in time, all of those boyhood playing war things had long been, extracted. This had become less fun and more of like, this is what you do. And it was a bad time for me after that, right? Like, I don't think I really processed, it effectively. My thought was, how do I get to the next, rotation? What's the next thing that I'm doing after that deployment? On the deployment itself, it was laser focused to like, we're not going to let all the AOP collapse. We're not going to lose this whole sector because now, like, Greg's out here forever. We're not going to let this happen. So our op tempo went like, I pushed it up higher, we all pushed it up higher. And we ran a lot of good other missions. 2-2 came down. We ended up getting an ANA SFODA, one of their special operations units who lived with us. That was a unique challenge in itself. Got a replacement. We got, new blood, Austin, the Rook, as he was called, the rookie. I don't know why we say these things, right? But there was actually like 3 or 4 months of the deployment left after that, right?
And that's something I really want to hit on, right? Because I think I spent time in the law enforcement community. When a cop dies, they mourn him for, a couple weeks. They have a big funeral. They put badges around, we put these little things around the badges. When you're on the battlefield, the war doesn't stop. And I think that's something that's lost sometimes on the American public is you don't get to stop what you're doing. They might have put you guys on a stand down, but it probably didn't last super long.
No, that was like 3 days,
Yeah.
right, for the psych to come make sure, like, and the chaplain to come talk to us, right?
And then you're right back into war. And so I think people don't understand when we talk about the toll of war, right? I mean, like what that's like. You don't get a pause to reflect, and you get to take a month off and process. You go back to war.
Yeah, and that particular one, because obviously we had lost an operator, to the entire like attitude of the sort of changed about the area, right? It was like pour all resources in there. I'm sure this happens in the law enforcement too, right? You lose somebody, go back even harder into the area. So we got tons of like the Commando Kandak came all the time. Actually, they gave us like a company of the Kandak to attach with us. We had the ANA Special Forces ODA with us, right? We really went out and like did a lot of operations. And actually, I think one of the most intense engagements that we had, was after that even, right? Like a month or two after that, like a super intense engagement. And that's almost like I think Greg would have been proud of that because we had him on the run for that. And my sort of commander at the end, who's now, he's a 1-star now. Great dude. He said, I think you guys were able to end, right? Not downtrodden. You went out and you came out like swinging, and I think that would have made Greg proud.
I couldn't agree with you more. Greg's gone, but his memory lives on in you and your team. What's the one story about him, maybe a quiet moment, a laugh, or a fight, that you carry with you that you want his family and the world to know?
I think you can't talk about Greg without it being a funny story. When we were collapsing the one village stability site in San Juan, right, and we were consolidating all together, for a period of time there, we manned it as a skeleton crew while we were waiting for the Afghans to come. Like, we had moved all the equipment out of there. It was just literally like holding it. And it was me, Greg, and like a handful of, I want to say infantry guys, like on the perimeter, right? So it was just us, right, in this huge fire base out in the desert, you know, just together. I'm talking like 3 or 4 people, super small. And we were just sitting there for like, you know, whole days while we rotate out. Just hanging out with Greg, talking, but like, he was so funny. He was so funny. And anyway, this is the story. We found all these old plywood. Like, there's all this plywood because we're stripping the base. And we decided to do like axe throwing and knife throwing competitions. Just me and Greg, right? Like, so we had, I don't know where we had axes, and like we had all these knives, right? So we had this plywood. So we're just like do axe throwing, right? Him and I. And I just remembered it was the funniest thing ever. And he kept hitting it, right? Mine would bounce off. It doesn't do anything, right? Like, I can't hit it, you know? And his would always hit. And he was so funny about it. He's like, you know, like, that's because he got the hair, you know? And then, you know, his nickname was the Swayze, you know, Patrick Swayze, you know, he's got the beautiful hair. And I think that just describes Greg so much, is that moment of like whipping that axe and hitting it and being like, you know, because he was like shocked as I was that it hit. But he was like, it's because of the hair, right? And that's, I think, just a story of his humor. And I don't know if he ever told that story to anyone, but like, it's the little things like that happened incessantly, right? Like, out there, it's just constantly just Greg being funny and being a good dude.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. One of the things you told me is that, you know, you needed something spiritual to hold on to after war. How has Greg's sacrifice shaped that part of you, your faith, your purpose, and how do you see him in your life today?
Well, I think key out of that is like the secret casualty of war. Obviously, Greg's the casualty, but it's the secondary casualties, right? Like, Gwen doesn't have a dad. Beth doesn't have a husband. You know, there's no son, there's no brother. Like, that cascading like pain goes on long after, you know, he's gone. And that's the harder thing to pick up in the long run, right? Is that relationship and what that means. And I think Beth's such an admirable like mom for carrying on for that. And it's just a person, right? Like, that trauma is its own type of trauma. This is our friend. This is our teammate. Yeah, we were there, but that's her husband. Like, that's everything. And I'll never forget that, because I know that toll for other people along the way. So what that means for me is I still struggle for what it means, right? Like, why are we here? Why do these things happen? And what is the purpose of that, you know, why has God allowed this, you know, in that sense? I still struggle on that. Obviously, it's Easter a couple days ago. When I'm in church, I think about this, and I think about, you know, that I hope I get to see him again in another world.
Yeah. Have you visited Greg's grave? I mean, a lot of people don't. Another thing, like, you know, Greg was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and you know, you guys weren't there because you guys were still at war.
Right.
Have you ever gotten a chance to visit Greg's grave?
Several times. Whenever I go to D.C., I go across the river, and I go up there. And it's not just Greg. Greg's nearby, several friends. And even in our own company, you know, like right down the row from Greg is Pepper. I think Pepper's from 2-3 or 2-6. I can't remember.
Because Pepper and Eccleston were both killed on that rotation.
Yeah. So that's 3 guys in the company, right? So it's not just Greg, right? I can mark my career walking in that area. You know, friends from the academy, guys from, Iraq. And it's weird because it's like, well, they're not there, right? But their memory is. But I go there all the time. I just sit there. And again, the piece of it, different piece. I reflect on the distinction of the desert and the heat versus the calm, sereneness of Arlington. I've gone there in the winter. I've gone there in the summer. Whether it's beautiful in DC in the summer. It's also bitingly cold in the winter. But I reflect on the difference of that versus how their last moments that I saw them. I love going there.
When you go there, I mean, you of all people know the toll of war. What's that feeling?
You're like, why am I here? Should I be here? Should I be there where they are? Why are they not here? It's not fair. There's a whole litany of that, right? Like, doesn't anybody even care? I don't expect people. I wouldn't even want a bunch of people walking around. People take the tours of Arlington. That's the thing, if you ever, when you go there on your own, you still go to the visitor center, right, to like check in and all that stuff, right? Because you got to park there, and you got to validate parking, right? You don't have to pay because you're actually going there. Because you got to get the pass to drive your vehicle like into the cemetery. And moving past the tourism part of it, it's hard to. It's weird, You don't want to I don't want to hate on them, right? Because they're Americans and they're here to see the thing. But I'm not here to see the tour. That's all I would think, for those who go there. Yes, take the tour. But every one of those stones out there, in some cases, the stones have multiple people in them. It's marked by their wife too, or them, or there's some also mass kind of tombs out there. Those are people, and they had everything, right? They had a childhood. They spilled their milk on the floor. They got yelled at as a kid, just like I yell at my kids. They had something that was joyful, their first laugh, first kiss. They have a marriage. They have kids. They have all these moments of humor. Yes, the imagery of it and their death is marked by the violence of war, but there's so much more than that. That's what I see. That's what I see in Arlington. It's I can't go there and make it a quick trip. I usually sit out there and just I don't call it sulk. I'll say sulk. I just sit out there on the grass. Just sit out there in the grass. Sit out there with them.
Let's take a break. All right, coming back. I know we ended on a kind of an emotional note. I wanted to take a little bit of a break, man, so we could both collect ourselves. Just kind of finishing up this interview and really, connecting Greg's service to the broader service, right? As we continue this series, we're going to hear from guys like Mike Swenson, Carl Hoover, Tim Bostian, and David Berg, who served alongside Greg, as well as Kevin Robbins from ODA 3422. From your perspective, what's one thing you hope each of them shares about Greg and the complete story?
I hope that they continue to really give just examples of the little finer moments of interaction with Greg, right? Like I mentioned, your life is a totality of all things. In the end, you're a tombstone or a bio or whatever it is, but that's not really what you were. Your memories, right? And if they give those memories voice, then it carries on, into others too as well. So I'm hoping that they'll share some of those funny moments, those serious moments, and kind of what Greg meant to them on their own journey, both during that deployment and in the case of Tim, long knowing him before that deployment, and some of the thoughts of the cost afterwards for their own journey. Those guys should all, I hope, tell you that wasn't their last trip. They kept going. David and Tim were on a different ODA together later on, did different rotations, right? Whole different kind of experience, and I hope they impart that we keep pressing, we keep going on. I know, our leadership at headquarters would also impress that, and really that they impart the level of quiet professional that Greg was, because it's absolutely, that's his descriptor.
Yeah, I think you and I were talking off camera, and it's really why I fell in love with the story. Although Greg was a great man and an honorable man, he definitely, was not normal, or I wouldn't say he was unnormal across the regiment. Like, I think the regiment, from what I can see from the outside looking in, is full of people like guys on your team, like Greg, that were willing to make that ultimate sacrifices, and many of there are many other Green Berets that did, and I think that's what at the heart of the story is just that quiet professional. And we're also speaking with Command Sergeant Major Waldo, who's the 1st Special Forces Command Sergeant Major, about, we're going to ask them stuff about what it means to be a Green Beret and kind of the legacy of soldiers like Greg. As their former team captain, what do you hope they say about the impact of Greg's service on the Special Forces community?
I think that they can describe and attest through their long service that our formation is full of men like Greg, that he is the uncommon, but a commonality of Special Forces, that quiet professionalism. Greg's the everyman of that inside the regiment. You can go and look at the names on the wall and look at the pictures. You go over to Charlie Mike's on the other side of post, and they have all the faces of the fallen from the regiment on the wall. And it's almost difficult to parcel through them, right? Because they all kind of can see the same. And then, in a sense, they are, right? They're all quiet professionals, and I'm sure that they will attest that is the marker of the regiment still. And I would hope that they would also characterize that legacy of service, continues as it has from the inception of Special Forces.
Yeah, amen. I think our nation is great, and Special Forces and the Special Operations community is a big reason why our dagger stays sharp as a nation. When you look back on that deployment in 2012, how do you weigh the importance of that mission against the price paid?
Well, it's a marker in war. It's a small slice, right? I'm sure you could look at the data of that day, and there was probably hundreds, if not dozens, maybe not hundreds, but dozens of troops in contact that took place across the country, IED attacks. Remember, at the time, simultaneously, we're still in Iraq as well, so that theater was there. I think it goes that, and even today, there are troops who are deployed in harm's way around the world. Our forces, they're always out there, right? They're always out there. So, did it move the needle? Probably not on its own, but that's not what moves the needle, right? Like, you're part of a totality of the force that holds the wall up. I'm a history guy, so I used to tell a friend of mine, actually my friend who was in the other ODA down south, we were trying to link into. We were talking one time, and I said, we always want these great Normandy Beach style victories, right, where we win. But really holding the wall, like the legionaries of the empire, is what you do, right? And there's no gratitude for the 1,000 years of peace, right, of the wall being held. There's only the victories, the great campaigns, but really it's the day in things, the little things that hold up the wall, that hold up the formation, that hold up the nation, and that's true across every single thing. I learned that from my dad. It's the little things going in and out every day that keeps the machine going. And that's, in that sense, it's not a failed mission. It's just part of the greater whole. And Greg's sacrifice, I don't know if it was worth it, because I can't say that, because it's not my sacrifice to bear. That would be Beth or Gwen to say that. But I will tell you that his sacrifice did hold up the nation, as all of ours did, and all of those who fought, all those who fell. And I think that's the true level of gratitude that we owe, family members, that their sacrifice did something for somebody else, and they having that level of respect, to what that means. So I think it mattered. I'll always believe that it mattered. Was it worth it? I think depends on who you ask.
That's a great point. How do you think your perspective has changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to talk about how the war ended, but it is an emotional ending for all who were there. My thought, though, is that it's a snapshot in time again, right? Like you can't see in the end to be like, oh, well, it didn't matter in the long run. It didn't matter for this. It didn't matter. No. That was a deployment. We went there as a team. We had a mission. We executed it to the best that we could. Unfortunately, we didn't all come home, but most of us did, right? And that was always the objective anyway, right? Go there, do our mission, make a difference, come home. So my perspective has changed a lot on that as I've gotten older and seeing moved up in positions and seen other operations and actually seeing casualties in other parts of the regiment too in training, right? Like other tragedies, in other theaters, at the range, whatever, what accidents. Each loss is its own level of tragedy. And as you get older too, we talked about this, the hidden cost of suicide, the destruction left on families, right? That is something that's very imparting to me of emotion of that the battle continues, right? The war's long over, but a lot of these battles keep fighting for guys in our community, and I think that should never be forgotten, right? And I think for our guys in our community, right, they should be proud of everything that they accomplished. They did everything they were asked of by their nation, and they accomplished it admirably and to exactly as the creed says, in the state as would be expected a special forces soldier. So I think they should be proud and never look down on what made it happen, because that's not our role to worry about that. We execute, we operate. They operated accordingly.
Yeah, and it's cool to see the Army evolve a little bit. I mean, I know the Army's rolled out the preservation of the force and family. They've rolled out the holistic training, and so hopefully the Army continues to keep coming up with tools to help the families and the teammates to continue to stay on in the fight while still managing the emotional toll that comes with it, right? Because it's a balance. I mean, it's something we talked about a lot. I mean, we still need warfighters. The nation still needs warfighters. We're great as a nation, and our military is a big reason why. And so, where's that balance? I don't know. I think we could probably have a whole nother podcast on that. But.
Yeah, each troop needs to meet their own spiritual balance somehow. That's never really talked about, but something that everybody needs to carry on.
Yep, this series is about ensuring Greg's legacy endures. How does it feel to be the one to start the story? And what do you hope the rest of the team's voices will add to this memory?
Well, it's a tremendous honor, obviously, to do that. I think that the team's always about them more than me. We're summer help. That's a joke, but it's not a joke, right? The team was there before me. The team was there after me. Those guys went on to other teams. And the officer moves up and, does their other things. And you're setting conditions, right? But those guys keep going out every day. And, they have my unbelievable, unbridled respect, right, to keep going out. They are quiet professionals. They keep going every time. So I think the team presenting really how committed they were and how selfless they were. I'm sure that will just come out, because that's the type of people that they are. But if I could impart anything, how would you describe your team? I'm selfless. Always others before self. And always about action, not words. Not a lot of talking. There's not a lot of bravado on our team. It's just more action.
Yeah, I talked to those guys a lot about you, and they had a lot to say about you. Those guys have a unbelievable, tremendous amount of respect for who you were as a leader. I mean, it's come out a lot in our conversations, and I mean, I believe the team, the guys that participated, they are participating because you decided to participate. And that just kind of brings me to my final question as we wrap this whole thing up. You later spent a lot of your career working in special activities and special operations. The ultimate quiet professional. Even when we talked, I had to really pull some stuff out of you. But I believe in your heart, the only reason you agreed to do this, is because of your love for your team and for Greg. But ultimately, what was it that made you decide to come on a camera and be vulnerable and to tell this story so that others can benefit and so Greg's legacy lives on?
Yeah. There's nothing I wouldn't do for them, right? And that's not lost on me either, right? Like, I'll talk to people a lot, and they're like, whoa, you talk to your ODA still? I'm like, yeah, every damn day. And like, how long ago was that? I'm like, I don't know, like 12, 13 years ago, something like that. And they're like, wow, that's crazy. That's emotional for me, right? Like, thanks, but like, I never did it for that accolade anyway. I just cared about them, right? Like, they were my dudes. They were good dudes. We had a bond that, nobody could ever like break. Went places other people never went. But that is our team. Every team is like that, right? Like, my friends, captains, other officers, NCOs, right? Like, they can impart their own stories of like that level of bond with their detachment. And that's really, that cohesiveness is what makes the formation, right? Like, it is that level of bond there, right? So now I wanted to make sure that people knew that that's how the regiment is. And I wanted people to know Greg's name, right? Like, yeah, he doesn't have a book, and he wouldn't want a book, but it's important for people to know like that guys like Greg are all those names on the wall. When I'm at headquarters, and they're all over, right? Like here, Tampa, wherever it is, the names are always on something. I walk past his name constantly. I see it, and I see other names of friends along the way on those memorials, and they're all like this. And I want people to say their names. We talked about this, right? The last time, a soldier dies twice: when they actually pass away, and when the last person forgets who they are. And we keep them going by talking about them, right? So that's really why I did it. I wanted people to know there was a dude named Greg Trent who's a great dude, great father, great husband, great son. And there's men like that all over the place. You just gotta look.
What an amazing story. I think, again, one of the things that will probably, you would never tell people, you drove 14 hours through the night, literally all through the night to get here, to be a part of this. And you had a million things going, and it was that important to you. I can't tell you thank you enough for not only being our anchor for the story, but also just for having the courage and the commitment, to put yourself on camera on full display in front of the American people, because this wasn't easy. I literally just asked you to relive the worst day in your career, and that's not lost on me. So from the bottom of my heart and from my crew, we just want to thank you, Dave, and thank you for being a part of the story.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I love the nation. I'll keep serving it, and I drive to hell and then back, and then keep going to go get those guys to do anything for them. So I appreciate what you did, what you're doing, and for Greg's memory.
That's awesome. Well, everybody out there, man, stay tuned. This is only, the first part of the series as we, transition to some of the other team members, so that we can tell, a full 360 view of this story. So stay tuned with us, and continue to take this journey with us. But in the meantime, stay safe out there. And if you can't be safe, be violent out here.